Good afternoon, and welcome to yet another topical and timely Ahmed webinar. This past Monday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with President Donald Trump for the second time during this Trump administration. Much to our dismay, President Trump seems to have more than a healthy dose of admiration for the Turkish Premier Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He referred to the nation of Turkey on Monday as, quote, I have a very good relationship with Turkey and with their leader, and I think we'll be able to work it out. So I hope that's not going to be a problem. I don't think it'll be a problem, unquote. And then the president added in regards to Erdogan, quote, I happen to like him and he likes me, and we've never had a problem. How dangerous is this for the nation of Israel that an Erdogan allied person, such as Ahmed al-Sharaa, or formerly Mohammed al-Julani, the president of Syria, seems to be under the increasing influence of Erdogan of Turkey? Turkey, who's a member of NATO, has already purchased the S-400 Russian missile defense system, and now it wants to purchase our F-35s. Should we allow this to happen? Here to answer these questions and many, many more is the wonderful FDD Senior Fellow, Sinam Sidi. Sinam is a frequent guest on I-24 News. He's also an a professor, of National Security Studies at the Marine Corps University. And prior to joining the Marine Corps University, Sinan was the executive director of the Institute of Turkish Studies at Georgetown University. He continues to serve as an adjunct associate professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Sinan is also the author of Kemalism in Turkish Politics, the Republican People's Party, Secularism and Nationalism, a book which clearly explains the electoral weakness of Turkey's main opposition, Republican People's Party. He obtained his PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London in 2007 in the field of political science. First of all, Sinan, since Israel seems to be so dependent upon the US for much of their weaponry and certainly for their support against the Houthis, along with much of their military hardware to fight against Hamas and Hezbollah, and possibly for support against Iran, how dangerous is it for Israel to try to defeat the Turkish influence within Syria, particularly since President Trump possesses such deep admiration for Recep Tayyip Erdogan?
Wow, that's a tough question. I mean, there are ample reasons, obviously, why Israel is worried about Turkey's sort of intentions inside of Syria. What does it represent? But also, it's obviously worried about what Erdogan's intentions are towards Israel through its presence inside of Syria. Um, I don't think there's an easy way to answer how worried they should be, but they have ample cause to be. Obviously, since October 7, the Israeli state has faced or is continuing to face multiple sort of vectors of threats, but it also obviously, does not welcome escalatory language or some may sort of see it as Erdogan's hyperbole. But nevertheless, I mean, all these threats and all this sort of rhetoric on the part of Turkey admonishing Israel are taken very, very seriously. But those are now also obviously backed by actions. What we have seen is not only Turkish military presence inside of Syria, but we've also seen and know quite for sure now that Erdogan is very much interested in being the main sponsor, the main backer of the Ahmed al-Sharaa-led government, what I typically refer to as the Al-Qaeda government of Syria. And we see how much influence Erdogan has on him, much to the chagrin of other regional states such as the Saudis, the Emiratis. And this is mainly for one reason, I assume, or I would argue. Erdogan and Turkey essentially pays the salaries of the Syrian National Army, and that shouldn't be mistaken with an actual sort of regular army that belongs to a state. it's just called the Syrian National Army. It's a hodgepodge of about 20 to 22 militia groups, Sunni militia groups, jihadist extremist militia groups. Many of them have ties to Al-Qaeda. We're assuming that a lot of these individuals, members of these militias, also have ties to former ISIS, right? And Turkey has basically bankrolled them and essentially provided them weapons training and pays their salaries to this day, mainly as a means to essentially, they were mobilized to sort of defeat the Assad regime, right? And so Sharaa now, Ahmed al-Sharaa relies or has to rely on them to maintain order inside of Syria, right? Without their support and without his essential sort of formerly HTS fighters, you know, it is very hard for this new administration inside of Syria to sort of hold peace and not keep order. And that's why Erdogan has a lot of sway on Sharaa, I assume. And we're going to see Sharaa visit Turkey next week, as well as the United Arab Emirates. And, you know, presumably Turkey wants to deepen its relationship with the government of Syria. And this is obviously concerning to Israel in terms of, you know, what are they seeking to do? And one of the things they think seeking to, and we've seen this sort of play out in the last few weeks, is Turkey seeking to sort of, you know, reconstruct and build former Syrian air bases and military bases and staff them with the Turkish military. One of them is actually very close to, or reasonably within, well, close to in terms of airspace, close to Israel, right? The T4 air base, which was recently bombed by the Israeli military just to sort of make its runways, etc., inoperable. But that was seen as a warning shot across the bow to Turkey saying, I don't want your fighter planes, your military presence installed here, because that would be in an airspace that is very sort of conflictual, right? There are no de-escalation measures between in the airspace between Israel and Turkey. Should Turkey use air bases inside of Syria and come close to or patrol the airspaces that Israel currently does? So how worried should Israel be about Turkish actions? I would say considerably, because Erdogan has no explicit sort of statement saying this is why we're militarily present in Syria, because Turkey has no history, right, of occupying another country, territorial expansion, with the one exception of Syria, which it's kind of very proud of sort of having engaged in regime change towards.
That Turkey wants to see the rise of the Ottoman Empire as it once was, before Sykes-Picot.
Well, I mean, this has long been a pet project of Erdogan, mostly in terms of rhetoric, and it sort of breaks with the sort of long-established tradition of Turkey, right? Being a sort of revisionist state, interested in expanding its territory. I mean, the Republic is just over 100 years old. It's 101 this year. But it was established on the grounds, and Turkey's founding treaty and basically the title to its territory was based on the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which the United States was an observer, but mostly sort of the former imperial world basically acceded to the establishment of the Republic of Turkey to succeed the Ottoman Empire, and to get that early. The Kemalist, or Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, renounced all claims to former Ottoman territories, save for what we now know as the modern Republic of Turkey, because he said that was the minimum what they would be willing to accept, but also the maximum of what they would be willing to accept. They gave up all claims of territory to the former Middle East, North Africa, the Greek islands that we know them today, and that was the sort of conciliatory as well as the sort of pragmatic, but also the realistic way that, Ataturk recognized the establishment of Turkey as a nation state and not a former empire. With Erdogan, unfortunately, his sort of political movements inside of Turkey, the Islamist movement, for years, they've essentially sort of peddled these narratives suggesting that, Turkey was cheated out of its former realms. We saw his former foreign minister, Ahmed Davutoglu, being the sort of brainchild of this. He has a terrible book called Strategic Depth, which he basically is the sounding cry for neo-Ottomanism, saying that Turkey should use its historical influence and position within the Middle East to lead the Muslim world. And we've never really seen that come into fruition, except now, obviously, with Turkey's sort of direct participation in the overthrow of the Assad regime and subsequent sort of bid to sort of be the new regime's strongest backer and use Syria as a means to sort of expand its influence, possibly its territory, but at least wield a sort of ideological weapon around the area, suggesting that everything has to go through them. I think it's precarious, but they're certainly interested in it. Yes.
Do you believe that there might be within Syria any renewed conflict between Turkish forces, Iranian forces, Alawites, Russians, Kurds, you
Right.
name it.
Yeah, this is one of the big conundrums of Syria, right? I mean, in terms of, will there be future conflicts? Will the peace last? Will this new administration, even though skeptics like me call it the Al-Qaeda regime inside of Syria, will it be able to sort of build an inclusive and stable Syria for all Syrians, such that, we don't go back to the prolonged civil war that we saw that was so destructive and so dangerous and so catastrophic? Um, I would say the odds are against it. Not because I'm a pessimist, but I'm just looking at this and thinking, well, how is this possible? I mean, what we're asking this new administration inside of Syria to do is to establish basically a modern administrative state, right? Along the lines of what Max Weber or you and I, what we recognize as state entity in the daily lives that we live, whether it's the United States or any other sort of average European country that we're from or we live in. Well, expecting that of, the Sharaa government, which we said, um, is composed of former jihadists who basically had an interest in destroying not just the Assad state, but establishing a caliphate in the region. And they're not interested in building a modern state that's inclusive. I mean, it wasn't too long ago when Al Sharaa was cutting off heads when he was close to, when he was a prominent leader of the Al Nusra movement inside of Syria, ties to the Islamic State. His so-called justice minister had executed a woman in broad daylight in 2016 because she was accused of being an adulterer. And when quizzed about it recently, he didn't even deny it. He just said, well, that was what the law required it to do of me at the time. And so just taking a sort of look at how that government, all these people are ideologically programmed. I'm just not sure how an administrative, an inclusive state that's built on sort of representative and legitimacy based grounds that you and I would understand is going to survive. So on the opposite side of that, we have the Alawite minorities inside of the country. We have a significant sort of Kurdish presence there, which really at this point is not interested in integration or let's see how these things work, even though they've signed deals with the central government and sort of have negotiations with them. I think that's just buying time, because if you talk to them, which I have, they have no illusions about the thing that, the prospect that this country is essentially not going to remain stable for that long. They're interested in being autonomous, at the very least, if not sort of totally separate from whatever transpires there. We see, Turkish ambitions inside of there, with the vis-a-vis Israel, but also there are competing Arab powers who would like to see a different Syria, like the Saudis and the Emiratis, I believe, would have, a vision for the country that is, free from Sunni jihadist or Salafist elements. And that's something that they have been investing in heavily for the last 30, 40 years across the region. I don't think they're too excited either. And obviously there's Israel in terms of like, well, I don't want a jihadist state on my northern front. I mean, that's not what, what would work for me. So I think the prospect of conflict exists. It's hard to predict where that will sort of spring from. But let's just say there are too many opposing forces there, that I think present significant challenges to a prolonged and stable Syrian state.
Right. Speaking of prolonged challenges within Turkey, on the domestic front, on March 23rd, the Turkish premier arrested his major opposition contender, Erkam Imamoglu, the mayor of Istanbul, and thousands of people advocated or demonstrated to support Imamoglu, and they were also arrested. Can you tell me how likely is that there might possibly be a coup within Turkey against Erdogan?
It's hard to say, but I would say the prospects of Erdogan being able to govern unquestionably and without any challenge from the realm of just the population, which has been sort of pretty dormant and pretty quelled up until this now, is less and less and less. Erdogan is facing a major public legitimacy problem, which he has not encountered before to this extent. Certainly not since 2013, when the last big public protest broke out, which he was able to essentially subdue. But at that time, Turkey was essentially economically very prosperous and growing, and actually in a position to sort of challenge, um, public defiance, mainly because there was a large swath of Turkish population which was kind of satisfied with Erdogan, and they saw the public protests that erupted back in 2013 as possibly just overstated by opposition groups. But now, we've had millions of people, rising up in like 2/3 of Turkey's cities, like 55 out of 80 provinces. We've seen mass public protests. They've been very hard to subdue, and they are cutting across all age groups, demographics, whether they're people, devout people, or secular people, whether they're Kurdish, Turkish, you name it, right? People have had enough, right? And Erdogan is basically just holding on to power by non-legitimate means. And we say that because the arrest of Istanbul's mayor is highly significant, simply because that was the one person, who held a primary, or who was about to hold a primary election as and be sort of anointed the main opposition party's candidate to run for president against Erdogan. And what did Erdogan do? Erdogan essentially put him in prison and basically said, the charges are so ridiculous, just unsubstantiated, just ridiculous notions of corruption, which, if you saw this man, if you know his by reputation, and he's the antithesis of that. He is a credible and essentially a dangerous person to Erdogan, because he's essentially going to, if there was an election held tomorrow, he would likely decisively defeat Erdogan. So we've never seen this in the history of Turkey, a sitting government preemptively jailing, Russia style, a viable political opposition. I'll go even far as to say, even when Turkey had military sort of coups that took governments away from civilians, when they handed power back to civilians, we never saw people prevented from running for office. Even the military, I'm trying to say, in Turkey, has never interfered with people's choices in terms of who is going to sort of run for national office to lead the country. Erdogan doesn't seem to care, mainly because he's realized that if he didn't jail him, then all bets were off, and he was just going to become more and more popular as he built momentum, right? And Erdogan is so unpopular because look, he has ruined the country's economy. I mean, if you look at the rate of inflation in Turkey, it's about 75-80% a year. People's incomes have not risen even by a fraction of that. I mean, the middle class has been destroyed. The retiree class has been destroyed. They have no purchasing power. Their ability to buy, pay rent, buy consumer goods, basic grocery shopping, buying meat. We've never seen this in Turkey's history. So people are thinking,
when are the elections supposed to be held, and will Imamoglu's name still be on the ballot?
Good question. So Erdogan doesn't really have to hold presidential elections until 2028, but there was a speculation and rumor that he was going to essentially bring them forward and have a snap election. And this is why the main opposition party basically thought, well, if that's going to be the case, let's just make sure that Imamoglu is anointed, and the party basically was just about to open up its ballot box to its party members, so that they could select, they could vote for whoever they wanted to be their sort of presidential candidate. And it's because of that Erdogan took a very sort of quick measures to get rid of him. But it's had catastrophic consequences. I mean, look, once you do something like this, this was the final straw for major investors in Turkey, right? So, for example, Morgan Stanley, it was the first clearinghouse to essentially just exit the Turkish stock market. Said, yeah, we're done, because this is, for us, it's a fundamental rule of law issue. I mean, there is no rule of law at this point. I mean, clearinghouses, investment portfolios, these companies will just about stomach anything. They don't really care about democratic governance or whatever. They're not a real advocate of that. But what I'm saying is, if they've taken the decision that they think there's no possibility of good returns from these markets, it's a gargantuan step. And the Turkish central bank has just sold off close to $50 billion of money, of dollars, right? To keep the national currency, the lira, stable. Erdogan doesn't care, right? All he cares about is regime preservation at this point. So he's gone to great lengths to delegitimize himself internationally, nationally, regionally. But if it keeps him in power, so be it.
Hey, one of our very erudite guests, Claire Lopez, has asked, can you talk about the relationship between Turkey's AKP with the US CMO and its Muslim Brotherhood members? Do you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I actually do not have specific traceable um, linkages that I could provide her, unfortunately. We assume that they have organic ties. I mean, Turkey, the AKP itself has been very sympathetic of the Muslim Brotherhood, although in the last 2 years, since 2022, because Erdogan seemingly wanted to rebuild his relationship with Egypt's Abdul Fattah el-Sisi, one of the preconditions of that was essentially Turkey had to put a distance between itself and disestablish the Muslim Brotherhood's organization inside of Turkey. So what we saw was a lot of the Brotherhood sort of characters from the Morsi government that was deposed in 2014, they were asked to politely leave. Erdogan shut down their TV station, etc., etc., etc. You know, I think he kind of did this with a light touch and politely. Um, but historically, yes, Erdogan has been very supportive of the Brotherhood, not least of all because of his outward support of Hamas, and that was the most sort of visual expression of that, and that still continues to this day. As far as like the AKP's like actual connection, CMO in the United States and Brotherhood, that's hard to put together. One of the things I could suggest if your listener wants to look up, we just released a report, a memo through FDD. It's on our website. It's just called Turkey and Hamas Partners in Terror. It's about a 16-page sort of document that looks into all the various ways that Turkey sort of entangled itself, but also entrenched its relationship with Hamas inside of Turkey. And there are implications towards its relationships towards the United States and how it comports itself as a NATO country. But as far as I know, that's the most sort of detailed look at Turkey's relationship with Hamas, and it's gotten a lot of traction. So I would just point that way. Just Turkey and Hamas Partners in Terror. It's free to just download and look at.
Gigi does excellent work all the time. Yeah. Um, Following Hamas's surprise attack on southern Israel on October 7th, Erdogan lauded Hamas as a liberation group. Um, and it also called them the Mujahideen waging a battle to protect its lands and people. Erdogan has certainly no love lost for Benjamin Netanyahu. He's likened him to Adolf Hitler. Can you describe and delineate the relationship that Erdogan has to the Muslim Brotherhood as opposed to how, for example, Qatar has a relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood or Gaza has a relationship? It's a kind of different relationship, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, I think what we can say definitely is, for example, Qatar likes to underplay and package its relationship with and its affinity towards the Brotherhood in a way that's, I'm not going to say palatable, but certainly ignorable by the United States and the Western Hemisphere. And they do that really cleverly, right? Because on the one hand, they will say, we don't support terrorism, but also look at all the things that we do for like international development and sports sponsorships. And, we play host to American university campuses in Doha. And, we're all about rights and freedoms. But on the other hand, we're a Muslim country and, we have relationships with Hamas. But even then they will say, look, you need that because that's, we helped with the negotiation of the hostage releases that Hamas took. So Qatar sort of packages it and makes it palatable in a way that makes it hard for US decision makers as well as European decision makers not to just shut the door on Qatar. Whereas, the Turkish perspective to this historically is if you look at Turkey's, Justice and Development Party, Erdogan's party, but also its parent company party that it sprouted from, the Welfare Party, which kind of exists in a different guise now, or let's just say Turkey's relationship with political Islam as a political movement inside of Turkey and its relationship and affinity towards the Muslim Brotherhood. This is mostly sort of, from their perspective, civilizational, right? I would say that the hardcore sort of committed members of the Turkish public who espouse this sort of like affinity, you'd have to couch this as like, I would say more than, you would not find more than 20% public support in Turkey for this sort of outlook. Most Turks in Turkey are dismayed and absolutely aghast at their country's international image in terms of what Erdogan has done to it. Take, for example, the death of Ismail Haniyeh. When Turkey ordered a national day of mourning, and all of its embassies and missions around the world, had their flags lowered to half-mast. We had people street interviewed in Istanbul and major cities across the country saying, "What do you think about that?" And overwhelmingly, you saw people responding to it saying, "I don't understand why we're holding a national day of mourning when some two-bit terrorist was assassinated or killed or whatever. Why are we doing this? This is ridiculous. Just embarrassing to say the least."
So, of course, that Turkey is a member of NATO. What would happen if Turkey and Israel were to go to war, or if Israel were to launch an attack against the Turkish presence in Syria? The NATO
Yeah,
motto, one for all and all for one. Where
correct.
would the
Yeah.
US be?
Yeah, that's the sort of scenario that nobody ever wants to think of, right? In terms of what to do about that. But let's just sort of say a couple of things that might sort of make people's minds a little easier. Although you can't take anything to the bank these days. One is, obviously, I think if you look at from Israel's perspective, Israel is not interested in a military confrontation with Turkey. I mean, it just isn't. Not because it likes Erdogan, but it would be catastrophic and really sort of distracting is not a good word, but just devastating in all sort of fronts, because it would be the first sort of military confrontation that the Israeli state would have to engage in with a mammoth of another military power, unlike the Iranians, the Lebanese, Hezbollah, and you're looking at a state actor with major capabilities, and that would be destructive. So nobody wants that. I would also say the Turks don't want that. As much as Erdogan's hyperbolic rhetoric and just belligerent stance and its military presence, inside of Syria, we saw his foreign minister basically say the other day, he went on TV when interviewed, and said, "Look, he says we are not interested in a confrontation with Israel. If the Sharaa government wants to essentially take matters, establish ties and relationship with Israel, that's its right to do that. When that's none of our business." I think that's the first sort of inkling of behind the scenes, behind the rhetoric, behind the sort of media-based belligerence that we see of Turkey, sort of coming to a little bit of reality. On the other hand, right, I would say if you just look at the sort of relationship status of countries, both on the Israeli side and the Turkish side, one of the things that Turkey would have to calculate if it was interested in military escalation with the Israelis is it doesn't really have a lot of countries in the region that really sort of see its perspective on the region, its on the world, and Turkey has no Arab friends. Let's put it that way. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, you name power, they're all suspicious of, or if not, like apprehensive of what Erdogan stands for or how it seeks to essentially challenge them. Right? That's a problem. On the other hand, Israel has obviously very strong ties with the United States, but also, it's formal, relationships with a number of Arab powers, and it is seeking to foster deeper ties with those countries. And also, I'm still of the opinion that the United States is basically treaty bound and obligated to essentially help out Israel in a way that in the face, if it faced an existential threat. Now, the NATO clause is interesting, but it's not definitive. Article 5 does not compel the United States to act and save another NATO country if it's aggressed. If anybody can look at the wording of Article 5 of NATO, it provides the United States the opportunity and the option of acting on behalf of it. That has to be considered. And when the NATO treaty was signed in 1948, 1949, you have to remember the only reason that the US Senate was willing to ratify that treaty was it basically if Article 5 avoided compulsion for the United States to act in one for all and one for. I mean, and Turkey knows this, right? So direct aggression on the part of Turkey upon Israel, I don't think, even whether it's this administration or the previous administration, I don't think Turkey is as a strong sort of US partner that would come to its aid. I would say it's quite the opposite. And even, the president's recent rhetoric, that we saw in the Oval Office the other day towards Turkey, saying Turkey, I still think, actions speak louder than words. I think that's a Trump tactic to essentially, say, look, Erdogan, there are things that could happen if you do one thing. There are things that could happen if you do another thing. What that means is, I think Trump is actually purposefully sort of vague and ambiguous when it comes to talking to Turkey, because he likes to keep cards in his own hands. But I don't think strong belligerent response to against Turkish actions would land Erdogan any favors.
Right. So you described the devaluation of the Turkish lira. And since Erdogan can't rely on the Turkish economy to finance all of his military operations, where do you think his money is coming from? Is it coming from Qatar?
Well, I mean, Turkey's been sort of doing economic sort of jingoism and lifeline, tactics for some time now, right? So, up until these protests started, there was a modicum amount of stabilization, right, throughout the country, which allowed Turkey to attract, inbound investment. Although these were short-term portfolios, sort of hot money. The other ways we started seeing sort of investment come in was actual better portfolios coming in, because there has been some reform initiative to stabilize government spending and cut those and basically put an austerity program without calling it an IMF program. It was a lighter version of that. That resulted in, I should say, the stabilization of the currency market. The lira stabilized, et cetera, et cetera. But then with these protests, we saw, I mean, the imprisonment of Imamoglu, which basically just threw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, it's just calamitous. Once the dust settles, even if it does settle, there's only so much foreign reserves so he can sell off to prop up, or central bank reserves he can sell until it becomes depleted, right? Just to keep the lira stable against the US dollar. On the other hand, Qatar is one source of, the way they do that is through currency swaps. It's an instrument which sort of, allows a certain amount of money to be, the Turkish lira swap for Qatari currency, et cetera, which helps sort of in the short term, the Turkish central bank receive inbound amounts of money. That's one aspect. They've done that with the Qataris, the Saudis. They've also sort of, $5 billion here, $10 billion there of inbound investment towards by Arab states, mainly for land sales or asset sales or infrastructure sales, which this sounds like a lot of money, but it really isn't. It's just sort of, dribs and drabs. It doesn't really help Turkey economically. The other way it was doing it was because, based on a depreciation, Turkey was increasing its exports, right? But even that's problematic because, yes, Turkey is exporting a lot, even though its currency is depreciated. But when you're making things, a lot of the components are imported. And those are imported based on hard currencies like the euro or the dollar. So again, I think Turkey faces a big sort of, drought in terms of inbound investment. The longer Erdogan keeps up these antics. And it's not good for him in any sort of shape or form in terms of what he does with this.
Was it 2013, 2014? My memory is getting a little rusty when Erdogan was blaming the military for the coup. Um, remember? And I'm wondering about the military. I'm wondering why they're not attempting a coup now. Can the military take things over at this point?
I mean, we've never been able to predict at which point in time that the Turkish military would become active to sort of actually challenge any political leader. They've always been a surprise in Turkey's long history with sort of military activism in the realm of politics. In 2016, when they attempted a coup, I mean, it just seemed like a sort of shambolic sort of rollout, which is kind of unaccustomed to Turkish coup making historically, when they've actually put on quite a robust sort of presence and well planned and well executed. And this is not me sort of like wishing for this. I think coup making in Turkey has cost Turkey immense amounts of capital in its democratic development. I think it's been very catastrophic over the long term. the impact of coup making in any country is devastating to a country's democratic future. The last successful coup that Turkey carried out was in 1980. The military ruled for 4 years, and arguably the impact of that is, 30 years downstream almost. It resulted in Erdogan's rise as a political actor. I mean, we can definitely make that correlation in terms of, one of the externalities of that last coup was to sort of empower political Islam in Turkey as a sort of protest movement against what the sort of military engaged in. So, following 2016 and the failed coup there, Erdogan is basically very much undercut and purged the military as much as he thinks he could have of all elements which he sees as a danger to him and his regime. Right? They purged tens and thousands of officers. They basically took over direct administration of the military's doctrine and officer development through basically closing down the military academies and establishing new ones, which essentially sort of try to develop a loyal officer to Erdogan. But I still think, he doesn't trust what he has in hand, right? And the reason I say that was because a couple of months ago, we had a graduation ceremony for this year's crop of, second lieutenants graduating from the new National Defense Academy that Erdogan created. And when Turkish officers typically graduate from a service academy on the day of their graduation, it's a big celebratory event. They get their sort of commission papers, and they typically profess their faith to the country's constitution and its eternal leader Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his principles and the constitution. So it's not a loyalty to any particular person, but to a set of ideals established under the Republic. And that's all officers have recited the same chant, the same oath when they graduated the academy, basically since the 1920s. This time around, Erdogan purged that year's, a crop of this year's essential graduates up for no other reason for these, they boisterously chanted their oath, which was seen to be politically active. And which, what I'm saying is, there are elements within the military. It's not a homogeneous organization. It's I think there are very different opinions across the ranks and the officers and the leadership. We never know if the military has become politically active, but they're watching obviously political unsettlements. They're seeing tens of thousands, sorry, millions of people. I'm sorry, of protests that have taken place in the past, since the beginning of March, and I would also suspect, not independent of the military, you could also probably start suspecting, what do his own cabinet make? His closest people, will they ever come to a position of walking up to Erdogan and saying, look, I don't think your position's tenable anymore? We just don't know how paranoid Erdogan is, because he puts less stock in public protests being able to remove him or force him out of power. But on the other hand, how much does he trust the military and his people inside of his government to have his back? And this is typically a problem of sort of authoritarian regimes like this, because they become paranoid, thinking, where am I going to face challenges in opposition? What could depose me? It's not peculiar to Erdogan. It was peculiar to Assad. It was peculiar to Saddam Hussein, Hosni Mubarak, right? Name your favorite authoritarian or dictator or whatever. These are similar problems that they have. One thing that always boggles my mind is, with Erdogan, yes, you've been in power 22 years as an individual, but here's the thing. What makes you think that you figured the secret sauce to eternal authoritarian governance? No one in your region has succeeded. No one, right? Nobody has. Name me one dictator that has succeeded in holding on to power. The person who's gotten off the lightest so far is Assad, who still has his life for now, we assume, right? But everyone else has had a pretty bad ending. So, but this is why they have their blinders on. They just think that they've taken the next step, which ensures their safety and the survival of the regime. But you get to a point when it's no longer tenable. I don't know if Erdogan will reach that point, but he certainly has to be thinking about where the threats are coming from.
So, could you just give us a word of your thoughts of selling the F-35s to Turkey, since they have the S-400
Yeah.
Russian missile defense system?
Well, it shouldn't happen. Not like this. Yeah, Turkey blew the opportunity to acquire the F-35, right? it put the payment down for approximately 100 units in the tune of $2.5 to $3 billion worth of payment back in 2019. It was about to receive its first units. We had Turkish pilots training here on their first platforms in Arizona, in Norfolk. They were about to take deliveries of those until Erdogan essentially purchased and had the delivery of the Russian-made S-400 system, which, by the way, they're threatening of deploying inside these air bases inside of Syria, right, which would be a problem. Turkey was also a member of the manufacturing consortium because if you remember, the F-35 is not a domestically made airplane here. It is part of an international consortium that Lockheed Martin, the parent company here, sources parts from all different partner states, and Turkey was a fundamental component of that manufacturing chain, right? So as a trusted ally, that was very beneficial to it. And again, it was booted out of that, and by the Trump administration in 2019, and slapped down with punitive sanctions under what we call CAATSA, the Countering of America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which is congressional set of sanctions initially destined for Russia, but basically intended for anybody who does stuff like this. And Trump was reluctant then, but he still had to impose them because they were congressionally mandated, and they're still in place. Now, the Turks have sort of played this long game, thinking that this administration, right, will be amenable to essentially lifting those sanctions and be in a position and willing to sell Turkey F-35s and bring it back into the program once again. Are they wrong? Maybe not. And if you ask me, why is this the case? I have no idea. I do not understand why this administration is looking favorably, and they are looking favorable to lift these sanctions and bring Turkey back into the F-35 program. How do we know this? Erdogan held a telephone conversation with the president just a few weeks ago, and Turkey's foreign minister has met with the Secretary of State a couple of times in person. And the rumors that we're hearing suggest that the administration is amenable. Rubio is on record for time immemorial, when he was senator, having a very sort of critical position of Turkey. He even sponsored legislation with members of both parties in Congress to essentially prevent Turkey, take further sort of punitive measures against Turkey for its S-400 purchases and its destabilizing role against Greek and Cypriot allies in the Eastern Mediterranean, not least of all its threatening position towards Israel too. If you ask me why he's sort of putting himself in a position with the administration to engage in these F-35 sales, I have no idea. It makes no sense to me. In return for doing that, or reauthorizing these sales to Turkey, then Turkey's basically saying, well, we might be, as a demonstration of our good faith, we could destroy a certain number of these sort of S-400 units that we hold on to. That should be enough for you. Oh, and by the way, he's saying, Erdogan has said to Trump, hey, I'll take care of the Syria problem for you, which can be seen as a sort of an interesting tease for the president, who really does not want to deal with Syria. And so Erdogan, who he seems to have a rapport with, seems to be sort of tickling him, saying, look, we'll take care of this, but also in return for destroying a bunch of these S-400s, can you also give us the F-35? And so far, the indications, and hopefully we're wrong about this, but not from what we're hearing, is that the administration seems amenable to this. And I think it's a dangerous path to go down. I don't know what Netanyahu's conversation with Trump yesterday, today, whatever, looked like on that front, because obviously that conversation came up. I think the Israeli government is clearly concerned. And I would say the only person to talk Trump down from going ahead with that is not Rubio or anyone else in the cabinet. It would probably be Netanyahu, if he has his ear. I mean, otherwise, I'm fearful that the administration will sort of work with Turkey on this. And, and you have to, the other side of this is, these are congressional sort of sanctions that prevent Turkey acquiring this. They should only necessarily be lifted by Congress. And Congress, even today, as well as the previous Congress, they're not friends of Turkey, as in, they would like to be friends of Turkey, but Turkey's not made, they're very aware of this. We recently, FTD, as well as other organizations, we recently had a congressional sort of hearing on Turkey in, I can't remember, it's one of the first congressional hearings in this Congress. Maybe it's about 4 weeks ago, on Turkey. And, these are sort of the questions that, congressmen in the House Foreign Affairs Committee really pose. And they say, for one, I think we still remain very concerned, and the sort of the leadership of both sort of foreign affairs committees in both houses, they're not interested in selling F-35s. But the problem is those sanctions can be lifted if the president issues a national security waiver. And that's, I think, where the problem lies. And hopefully that can be prevented. And hopefully, Trump's words are more sort of ambiguous and sort of realizing what Turkey's sort of the threat that Turkey continues to possess with those S-400s, which could prove very detrimental to the future of the F-35 sort of stealth capabilities if it is sold to Turkey. So we'll see.
Right. How old is Erdogan? And can you comment on his health?
I know exactly how old he is because his birthday is very close to my mother's. He's 71. I don't know what, I don't know what stress does to a body of that caliber, but he's been in power nonstop since 2003. He's always rumored to have dealt with this, notion of colon cancer, although it's never been sort of publicly confirmed. He's had some mysterious treatments in places like Cuba, and so he continues to sort of thrive. I don't know. We have no indication or idea of as to like what his condition is because it's never released and what kind of treatment he's receiving for any ailments. And we've never confirmed that they've never confirmed he has any ailments. His health though is hit and miss. You can sort of see some days he's very sort of, spry and sort of active on the stage. His bellicose speech is right up there. But on other days, just as frequently, when you see him sort of walk around, or when he's like comes out of a car and sort of walks around, you can see he's struggling. I would say he's 71 going on 91, based on like the amount of stress his body is eating, but it's this constant it's not stress like job stresses that you and I might have. It's paranoia. You are just you're on top of the country, and so to say. But that in itself presents its unique set of problems, right? I mean, what if Erdogan was to keel over tomorrow? I mean, the Turkish constitution, in the way that he redesigned it to put forward this presidential system, which Turkey is very new to, which only started after 2017, that empowered the presidency to a sort of unaccountable level. It's not really clear in terms of power transition. It's not. I mean, we assume it's going to go to this sort of elusive vice presidential figure, but do elections have to be held? I think there's an overwhelming amount of public pressure. If Erdogan was interested in anointing someone as a caretaker or a successor, I mean, again, he could try. That's one area where I don't think he has a much chance of success. And this really is what really separates the Turkish Republic from, say, a place like Russia. Putin can appoint whoever he wants, and basically the system falls in line. I mean, Turkey has no experience in that, but also, even like I said previously, even despite military interventions, the people are accustomed to voting and choosing who their leader is and their government is, right? Since 1950, successive elections after election. This is why you've seen these protests finally erupt in the millions across the country when Erdogan jailed Imamoglu. My point is, let's say he nominates one of his son-in-law, this guy called Selçuk Bayraktar, major defense contractor, CEO, this and that, married to his daughter. He was often thought to be one of the sort of front-runner successors. Great. Where's that kid going to get public support from? I mean, can he rely upon institutions and the military to hold his back like they do Erdogan's? I doubt it, because he's not going to be the only contender. You have the present foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, who's also seen to be another sort of political heavyweight that is supposed to be sort of succeeding Erdogan. He's not just going to let Erdogan's son-in-law walk all over him, right? And they're not the only two. But on top of all that, you've got a public right now in outcry that's not just going to just shut up and go home. So I think even if he keels over, which I think this is actually a good scenario, even if he keels over, he's incapacitated. The regime's ability to just anoint someone and just let that be the end of it is not a reality. I think I'm not sure if they're aware of it, but when I've studied the country as for a while, and I understand sort of the electoral dynamics and public preferences. Turkey can't essentially do what Russia does, right? We don't have elections where 90% of the votes goes to Putin magically. Erdogan won the presidential election back in 23 by less than 1.5%. It was close, and we assume that he didn't have his thumb on the scale. We assume, right? I'm just saying it's hard to sort of just pull the hood over people's eyes in Turkey and just say let that be the end of it, because right as we see things now, they're not going to shut up and go home, and they loathe this regime. They want it to be done, right?
So, do you feel if Imamoglu will be imprisoned, he will still be a reasonable contender? Can people still vote for him?
Who knows? I mean, you have to remember that when Erdogan ran, he was he was banned from politics. He was actually doing prison time like Imamoglu, and like Imamoglu, he was there for like ridiculous charges. This is 1998. Doesn't seem that long ago. And then obviously when he came out of jail, he was still prevented from running for office in 2002, 2003, because there was a political ban on him. That was the condition of his release. But there was a tremendous amount of international pressure at that time applied on Turkey, not just by the United States, but also the European Union, who essentially wanted to work with Turkey, post 9/11, and they needed a good, honest sort of representative government, and they were not willing to sort of let the military-esque sort of pressures at that time preventing Erdogan, who was overwhelmingly popular and was poised to win elections, from seeking and gaining office, right? So those pressures were impactful in getting the courts to essentially lift that ban off him. These days, unfortunately, I don't think Imamoglu has the same sort of advantage on the international scale. I don't think he's going to get any support from the United States government. I don't think Europe is essentially going to step up and champion Imamoglu, saying, "Hey, Turkey, get rid of," because what leverage do they have over Turkey? Trump seems to value the relationship with Erdogan. He's not certainly going to sort of back Imamoglu for no good reason. Europe, as much as it wants to condemn Turkey, is also bent over a barrel for two reasons. The Europeans demand or depend upon Erdogan to keep refugee flows out of Europe. Yeah, I mean, Europe pays Turkey for this, right? That's one. Two, now with the Russian escalation inside of Ukraine, and seemingly in a position where the United States is not willing to follow up its security commitments to Europe, Erdogan has stepped up and said, I am the security guarantor of Europe. So on both those grounds, Europe is not going to be in a position to say, release Imamoglu, otherwise what? Erdogan's going to release refugees and not help with European security. I mean, you see, Imamoglu lacks those playing advantages. And at that, and when Erdogan, it wasn't just the international pressure that Erdogan, got elected in 2002, and that sort of pushed the courts to lift the political ban. It was also at that time the courts were not necessarily as compromised as they are now. I mean, in 2002, Turkey still had rule of law, right? It was an imperfect democracy, but compared to now, I mean, it was. Oh, excuse me. Well, let me just. Phone call coming through. I'm sorry. So I think the only way this happens is, sure, Imamoglu sort of probably stays on the ballot, or maybe not. The party's chairman, even though Imamoglu is the presidential candidate, party's chairman might see that as an opportunity to say, well, Imamoglu is in prison, so I guess I'll have to be the nominee, maybe. So we might see sort of political infighting on that level. But obviously a lot could happen. There's just too many unknowns. Will the political process continue to push Imamoglu? Will there be further destabilization? Those are certainly possibilities. The other thing that we could see, obviously, is, like I said, when we talk about Erdogan's health, what if he's incapacitated, right? Then I'm assuming that courts and judges and political actors might be looking at sort of like which way the wind's going to blow. I mean, to the extent that judges are beholden to Erdogan now, if they feel that Erdogan's no longer in charge of the country and they hold up a ban on Imamoglu for no other good reason than Erdogan told them to, someone's likely to call them and say, look, what you're doing is illegal. You're holding a man in detention under duress without charging him, and who has not been convicted of any crime. And if you don't release him and allow him to run, then once he is released and it takes office, you stand a good chance of going to jail. You see what I mean? In terms of the absence of Erdogan is likely to create a big vacuum across institutions, and people usually fall in line. because they fear Erdogan. If Erdogan's no longer around, then right, they're going to start to sort of see who's essentially someone that they can count on.
I actually could talk to you, Sinan, forever. I find this conversation is really compelling and illuminating on a region of the world that we really have to focus more attention to. There were a lot of other questions, excellent questions, that came in as to why did Trump open the door for Turkey and Syria, especially when
Yeah.
he pulled U.S. Troops from northwest Syria and abandoned the Kurds, which is really, although we still have, what is it, 2,000 troops? How many troops do we have on
About
northwest?
2,000. Yeah, they could be pulled
Yeah,
at any time. My assumption still is Trump's going to pull them at some point. Maybe after
yeah,
Erdogan might come to the White House before the end of this month. That's on the cards.
yeah. This is very, very problematic, and I really can't wait to have you back again, Sinan. You are a
Well, thank you for
treasure
having me.
trove. Thank you so
Appreciate it. Oh, thank
much.
you very much.
Yes, please remember to support both FTD.org and Sinan's wonderful work and the work of AhmedOnline.org. I do have to say, back in 2019, we worked our guts out to make sure the F-35s were not sold to Turkey. And we are again working on that, but there are a lot of formidable forces on the other side this time.
Correct.
But thank you so much, Sinan. It's such a
Thank you,
pleasure.
Sarah. Thank you for having me.